Greetings, Kristin. It's incredible to have you here. All of the nuns and myself in our community have taken the journey that you've created for Buddhist practitioners who are interested in ecological and climate issues, the eco-sattva training, and it's been really important to all of us. And you really were a guide to us as we're developing our own projects in the area of ecology and Buddhism, and it's just a delight to have you here today.
Oh, well, I am so honored and delighted and have been so moved by the projects that you're undertaking and doing the incredibly important work of understanding some of what One Earth Sangha is offering and then sharing it with a community that really we're not in a position to reach and communicate with. So it's such a gift, and to have your wisdom and that group's wisdom, really everything that you bring to it. I'm so excited by this collaboration. So thank you for inviting me. And maybe I'll just take a moment to say where I'm coming from and honor my teachers and my benefactors. So I'm joining from the Piscataway, historical lands of the Piscataway people in the Potomac River Valley, also known as Washington, D.C. Absolutely beautiful land, and I'm grateful to all the beings, including especially the Piscataway people, for loving this place into its well-being for so many, many generations. And I also want to acknowledge my teachers, all the way going back to the Buddha, of course, and including my own teacher, Rob Burbea, and Catherine McGee. So I am always and ever bringing forward whatever is offered here is really because of their generosity and those who have supported them. So thank you again for welcoming me here.
Thanks, Kristin. So we are living in incredibly trying times with multiple systemic crises. We experienced a global health crisis during the pandemic, and now we're facing social, ecological, and planetary changes coming at us really fast. Climate is changing, species are dying off, ecosystems are being brought to a point from which there is no recovery. And these unprecedented changes obviously take a heavy emotional toll on everyone who's living through them. Yet for so many reasons, we tend to focus on the anxiety and distress that all this uncertainty and change causes, as if it were a personal inadequacy and not a natural or sensible response to these times. We feel we're having a hard time emotionally because we're not managing our lives well, or we don't manage our emotional life well. And so we turn to spiritual practice, many people, to help us manage that situation. But in many cases, those spiritual teachings can end up leading us away from the systemic changes that need to be made and keep us focused on addressing our own personal struggles. And you and I have had conversations around this in the past, but just privately. So I wonder if you could talk about some of the ways in which you see something like this happening in Buddhist communities in particular, and share your reflections on what a spiritual practice such as the Buddhist path can offer to people who are distressed by ecological and climate crises, or who are overwhelmed as they try to come to terms with the large-scale change and even contribute to it.
The first thing I would say is you are not alone. You are not alone in feeling in a lot of pain, having a lot of grief, feeling maybe angry, feeling afraid, feeling very sad, feeling overwhelmed. It can be overwhelming. I mean, really, to fully turn towards what is underway, it feels, I would suggest, otherwise impossible, except for the wisdom and practice that can support us in settling and grounding. And so I would say that Buddhist spaces, Buddhist ideas in the convert communities in which I experience them here in the US are really bringing something very important and vital, which is teaching us, supporting us in the ability to turn towards what is difficult and meet that with compassion, meet that with a sense of welcoming and tell me more, and really the settling, but also the grounding in the body, to really experience the body as a location that is here and not in some terrible future, not in a place maybe of raging against those who we maybe are identifying as responsible. The body can be this incredible, and I would say underappreciated by so many of us, source of deep support. That grounding, and then the body's ability to work with that difficulty. The challenge is to not stop there, to say that is a necessary and important beginning. But what the practice also invites us to do, what the Buddha's wisdoms and practices invite us to do, is contemplate internally and externally, to then widen the lens, to see that my suffering is conditioned by a set of circumstances that I need to maybe step back and appreciate that the way forward is not simply for me to metabolize and work with this difficulty and then get back to work or get back to, it is to investigate not only the sources of my own suffering, but to investigate the sources of our suffering, to really look closely at what is underway without making enemies, but also to say that there is accountability here, that there is harm being done woven into the way that we relate to each other, to our ecological relatives, and to the earth herself, that are, of course, impacting this being, because this being is of those things as well. And so the pain that we feel is in some ways a testament, evidence of our belonging, evidence of our interrelationship. When we hear the news of an ecosystem in decline or maybe in collapse, we feel it, and that is evidence of our deep relationship with that. It is not a distant caring, a kind of sympathy. It is a connection. And that can point us in the direction of responsivity that doesn't stop with this skin.
So you talked about Buddhist practices that can ground us in the body, that can help us to make the connection or make the transition from internal to external. Could you talk about specifically what teachings and practices you see as helping to build that bridge?
Yeah, I would say that this particular notion, really powerful insight that every moment is a product of conditioning, and also itself conditions the next moment. Because of this, that. Because of that, this. That we are always conditioning something. That is to say, we are shaping our experience through our words and actions and through our way of looking. We are setting up what is possible and what is impossible. So we know this from our experience of individual suffering. When I'm really, really upset with somebody, my body can feel really tight. My thoughts get really fast. I feel a sense of separation from myself and this problematic other who's really to blame, or maybe I'm really to blame and I feel really terrible about that. And it's all very contracted. And when I have the wisdom and practices supporting me in settling, in loosening some of that contraction, in reducing my aversion, either for self or other, then those thoughts are revealed as really being a product of the way that I'm looking, being a product of the charge. So that experience was itself being conditioned by the conflict and my way of looking and my reactivity. So these are ideas that we practice and explore quite a bit in Buddhist circles and spaces. This is the possibility of bringing Buddhist wisdom and teachings beyond the psychological, the individual self, to the collective self, the sociological. We can see how not just I can become reactive, I can harden against a problematic other. I can presume a right to exploit or consume another, let's say an animal. But we can do that. And we can harden against problematic others and make a story about them and have a sort of collective papancha, this cascading set of thoughts, reinforcing. We call that collectively polarization. We become polarized. These very experiences that we have at the individual level are also happening at the collective level. And let me just add one more dimension to this, because it's really important and I think very helpful to see that what happens collectively has a life beyond our individual lifetimes. Because at the collective level, we create literature, we create policies, we create institutions that outlive individual human lives. And so you can, in a way, what's happening is the influential individual and collective human ways of looking and ways of responding, values, priorities, presumptions, delusions, become codified. They kind of accrue over time. So we can look back in history at and see really diluted thinking. We can see really beautiful thinking in some cases and really diluted thinking in some cases. And then each of us is born into a culture that has a way of looking, that has some priorities. And it's very hard, if not impossible, for us as little beings, little vulnerable beings, to refute that. It is a matter of survival that we take on that way of looking, that we take on these priorities, that we take on these values, that we take on these prescriptions of what success is, what to do, what not to do. Of course we would. Of course, every one of us, in a way, must, if we are to survive this vulnerable project of growing up. And so we can be really compassionate with ourselves and with each other for the ways in which we not only receive, but then participate in and further cultural misunderstandings, collective delusion. And with careful, compassionate investigation, we can identify that individual delusion and the collective delusions, the collective harm. This is very, very helpful because it says, of course that would happen. Of course you would adopt these thinkings. And yet, we have freedom to respond, to conceive anew, and to work together to make new policies, make new institutions, and support policies, institutions, cultural ideas that are really onward leading, wholesome, supportive to mutual flourishing, including each other, our ecological relatives, and the earth.
So, as a spiritual path that's dedicated to facing and relieving suffering through compassion and wisdom, one might expect Buddhist communities to be full of wise and compassionate initiatives to face the climate crisis and to face other collective forms of suffering. But that's not really the case when we look around. And, you know, we've spoken and you've spoken about spiritual bypass as one reason why so few Buddhist communities are active on ecological, social justice, and other collective issues. Could you describe what you see when you think about this kind of paradox in the values that we are cultivating and then this inaction on the issues, and how spiritual bypass might come in there?
Yeah, it's like, I think the first thing to say is like, I really love these teachings. I really love these communities. So all of my reflections about this is just said with, you know, a warm invitation to be in conversation with each other. And I'm still learning, but I do see some things that I think really limit our ability. And there's of course, and yet even in that, right? Because we are a collective community. And diversity, so much diversity within that too. So I speak only from the experience that I've had with the communities that I've been a part of. So I think there are two flavors of this. One is a more classical, we would call it, or maybe early Buddhism flavor of this, of the end run around the necessity of responding to suffering. And that is that the project of this life is actually nirvana, escape, non-returning. That is to say, I really engage in a very intense, really demanding, beautiful process of waking up, cultivating all the characteristics that the Buddha would encourage me to cultivate right here in this system. And then if I do that well enough, I become enlightened and I don't return. There's no reincarnation. So that's a very classic view, but it kind of says like, this is a problem field. And the objective of spiritual practice is just like Christian and other Abrahamic religions, the objective is escape. It's heaven. And we have that in this tradition. It's taken on, okay, so then there's a kind of updated flavor where maybe we don't think that reincarnation is real, or we don't really think about escape from the endless rebirth as an objective. Maybe we want endless rebirth, or we don't necessarily believe in reincarnation at all. The way that Buddhism, as it has shown up in the West, is to fit into a really very important space of helping us, as I was saying before, psychologically work with our suffering. And secular mindfulness, so much beautiful skill when the Buddhist ideas are intersected with how much the Western culture has an appetite for and a skill with psychology. So those have been some mutual flourishing. And it has kept the location, the domain of the project, again, very much here. And so the new variety is...
When you say here, you mean in the individual?
In the Western convert communities in those spaces, the project is, this is the scope of practice. And my job is to work, the theory of change, if you will, is to develop a beautiful individual who can then do good things in the world. Good actions and words will come from the one who has really metabolized all their suffering. And then we don't need to speak to systems. We don't, because we are cultivating people who can see systems and other things very clearly. So it's a very step one, step two kind of approach. And it doesn't feel the need to identify the causes of harm, the causes of suffering, the causes of moral outrage that are happening collectively, because we just leave that to individuals. And then there's another aspect that both share, which is the Dharma will conceive of itself. These teachings are communities, are spiritual sanghas, that spiritual community in its projects will conceive of itself as apolitical. That is, not having a politics. We don't take sides. There's something at the root of it really lovely about the invitation to not let one's passions have us get for or against this one or that one. That's, I think, the useful root of that. But it becomes delusion when we think that what we're doing and the way that we're doing it is completely outside of collective concerns, that it's not energizing, contributing to anything at the collective level. Again, we're just making beautiful people. When we conceive of ourselves as apolitical, without any politics, what we're really doing is saying that whatever's happening collectively is fine. We end up indirectly supporting status quo power relationships, status quo social practices. We're just kind of removing ourselves and saying, you know what, we're kind of above that. We don't really go there. That's too dangerous. That upsets people. The effect of that is to energize, make people who are can conceive of themselves as not picking sides. My favorite example of this is on the Amazon warehouse floors. There are these little booths called the Amazon booth. And you can walk into this little booth, and there's a screen in front of you with maybe a beautiful beach scene. And you can put on headphones and have, or just maybe it's in this really beautiful speakers, and you can enjoy beautiful music and see a beautiful scene of nature, probably. And you can find your Zen place. You can find your peaceful center and calm down. And then you have your 20 minutes and then you get back to work. That is completely consistent, I would argue, with the ways that convert communities in the US, especially in another dominant cultures that I'm familiar with, that's how we do it. That's the scope of it. And so that worker doesn't challenge the system. They just go back to work. And
never going to unionize.
They're not going to unionize. They've metabolized all their suffering. They're just saying, hey, this is, causes and conditions. It's all fine. If I have anything that upsets me that's happening here, I should just go back to the Zen booth and I'll be fine. And then I come back out and I'm back to work. So that, I would say, is a kind of extreme example of how the Dharma can conceive of itself as apolitical, when actually there's something really political about quelling the maybe rightful upset, anger that that person might have, that they might beautifully express without harm. If the Dharma supported us in finding useful, beautiful, onward leading ways of collaborating with each other and challenging these really brutal systems that we are, so many of us are a part of.
You explore the intersections between spiritual practice, ecology, and social justice, and the ways that they can complement or support one another, that one can cast light on the other, but also the way that one can cast shadows on the other. And then the ways that into those shadows, others can be casting light. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see the interplay and intersections among these three domains, and what is the light and the shadow at work there?
Yeah. I really love this territory. It's really been a helpful framework for me. So the core, the essence of the idea is that if you picture a sphere, maybe it's the earth, right? And like there's this bright light, maybe that's the sun. It's beautiful. It's so nourishing. It's actually vital. And it casts this incredibly gorgeous light. And we can see so much because of that light. And every light casts a shadow. There is no light that doesn't cast a shadow. So, and we can understand what's in that shadow from that particular light, maybe. And we can also understand how to see into that shadow. How do we see into another shadow? Through another light. So we bring another light that might illuminate what's in that shadow. So there's this framework of, if we just, I mean, there are many, many lights that are available and that we really might need and choose for ourselves. And we might choose complementary lights so that the light from, say, the spiritual, the Dharma in this case, is really beautiful. Maybe we love it. And we can be aware of its shadow tendencies. That is to say, its problematic tendencies, its vulnerabilities, the ways that it can cause harm. And then there's the social justice light, absolutely gorgeous, so necessary, and can actually see into the shadow of the spiritual, of the Dharma in our case. And then there's another light, which is the ecological. And that can see into the light of that Dharma and also see into the light of into the shadow that is cast by the social justice. So that idea of multiple lights that can be brought to help us illuminate our world. I mean, in our case, the sun, there's all this rotation. In this, we don't have that movement. We need to bring multiple lights, or maybe we need to move the sun around to these different positions, however you want to think about it. So then to begin, let's look at both the blessings, the beautiful light of the spiritual, of the Dhamma. So here is the invitation to move against the stream, to recognize the problematic habits that, of course, we take on in our conditioning, and the problematic ways of looking in particular of separation, that sees myself as separate, and I'm this individual over here, and it's zero-sum gain, and my loss may be another's gain, and vice versa. So that fundamental misunderstanding of, yes, of course, there's a self over here, but fundamentally woven into the rest of life. This is the invitation of the Dharma. And then with that, this beautiful support in turning towards our suffering, whether it's the heart's smallest jealousy. There you are, jealousy. I see you. I don't blame you. Ooh, that hurts. To global climate change. There's no suffering that this turning towards cannot meet and bring wisdom and compassion to, soothing even the worst distress. There's the investigation into what we perceive, into this really supportive questioning of, are my perceptions completely trustworthy? No, they aren't, and that's okay. That can actually be held and met without losing my center. I can investigate in what I perceive as real as maybe not so real, especially this constructed nature of myself and my view of the world, my view of the other. It's a product of what we were talking about before, causes and conditions, my way of looking. That can be, in a very friendly and tender way, investigated, questioned. And then there's this incredible, it's just such a gorgeous framework of a path for cultivation and a community that can support one another in the path of awakening, of coming to see the truth. So all these Buddhist lists of what we're given to undertake as spiritual tasks so that we can awaken. So there's so much more that you could say, that we could say about the endless gifts of wisdom and practice, that it's all held in this framework of practice. It's endless, and I think largely untapped, especially in relationship to these massive changes underway, into this incredible moment in human history where we're moving into increasing, accelerating uncertainty. We need these kinds of things to really support us, and the invitation to do that with one another. So that's a little bit, hopefully, a little touching on what's so beautiful about the Dharma and so necessary, that beautiful light. And there's some shadow. So that if that was some of the light, what's on the shadow side of this? What shadow is cast by that very light? And some of this the Dhamma speaks to, and some of it doesn't. But the first one is like that I would identify as in holding this kind of idea of ultimate wisdom. The kind of stereotypical view of the Buddhist master, who's really quite actually not just wise, but a little aloof and maybe a little too detached, doesn't really care, removing ourselves from the world in a way that is that transcends in a all of human suffering and can't be bothered in a certain way. That maybe I have all these amazing conditions around me that support me in just pursuing my spiritual practice and not engaging with the world. And yet I am in that really separating myself from the world. Another aspect of that shadow side is that we can, in a way, blame the victim. Someone is suffering from colorism. They're suffering from classism. They're suffering from these collective systems that really cause physical, economic, material hardship. And our practices can sometimes see that as mere suffering. And even to be told that it's illusion, that we're sort of caught in reactivity if we're struggling with patriarchy. If we're really we're a victim of some of these social patterns, that it's your problem and what you should do is sit with that. That is a certain kind of harm that the Dharma can do. If we're suffering about what's happening to the earth, our eco-anxiety is just another form of suffering, and it's to be soothed. So sit with that. So it's a kind of limitation. I think of just a failure to widen the scope, to see that collective mind, and to see that we are all part of that collective space. That's collective conditioning, and that we have just as we have a role to play in meeting our own individual suffering skillfully, we have a powerful role to play actively meeting and transforming that collective suffering. There's another, I'll just say maybe one or two more. There's a self-ennobling quality to this. That is to say, we set ourselves up as the good ones. We're the ones who get it. We're the ones who meet reality as it is, because we practice with things as they are. And there's, again, in every one of these things that I'm identifying, there's something really beautiful and right about it, because it is powerful to accept this is happening. This is how things are for me right now. But to say that we have an understanding that others don't about how the world works and how the mind works and what is the nature of suffering? Yes and no. We're a little bit kind of too self-satisfied. We can be too self-satisfied when taken, when not properly managed. It can become a sort of prideful, like we're the ones who get it. And I would say the error there is placing the absolute over the relative. The we're all one over we're wildly different, and each one of us unfathomable. I don't ultimately know myself. How could I ultimately know you? How can I say that we are the same? In fact, the Dhamma speaks to, in a teaching about mana, neither better than, nor worse than, nor even same as. So that is a teaching about the relative. We cannot really know one another or ourselves. And there's this wild unfathomability to the whole nature of experience, including what we collapse into the other and the world and this one over here. So those are just a few ways that I would say that we can downplay these ethical breaches that are commonplace in our society, the ways that we can add insult to injury, and we deny our own conditioning and the limits of our own perception, and in that way further marginalize and alienate each other. And so those are ways that we can bypass justice. With respect to the ecological, again, we can, as I was intimating before, we can be told like, oh, you're suffering with species loss, with water crises, you're suffering about what's happening to the earth. In large and small ways, that's just illusion. That's just suffering. Like there's a slow destruction of nature going on, and sometimes again in the classic form, we can be told like, oh, the Buddha predicted this. It's inevitable. Practice while you can. But in an updated version, it's to locate that suffering here and to treat it sort of as generic suffering. It is so beautiful to see what can happen when those come together, when we can acknowledge what is happening to the earth and see the impact on ourselves and bring this incredible wisdom and practices to understanding the causes and conditions, and to see it as an individual and collective responsibility that we can practice our way into. It is really hard to bear what is underway, and we need each other, and the Dhamma can really support us in a way forward together. But that is not what is commonplace, at least in a lot of the Buddhist communities that I am familiar with. It's increasingly happening, but I think we have a ways to go there. I think it's also important to see that Buddhism has had a long history of being sponsored by wealth, and the generation of that wealth has often come at the cost of the living earth community, people, and planet. So it's a kind of distancing that we do with, we don't mind, literally, we don't mind the sources, how that wealth was generated when it comes to support the Dhamma, to support Buddhist teachers. It's all okay. And I'm not saying that we need to shut off those sources, but we are actually acting inside of a system when we receive that wealth. We're taking the benefits from sometimes exploitation. If we're not paying attention to its sources, we are indirectly benefiting from harm. And yet we have found, one could say, and I mean this with all love, a relatively convenient way of relating to that wealth so that we don't have to turn it away. And that can be lovingly questioned, I would say. Another piece of this is that the Dharma can really colludes with centralizing the human being. It is, we are, even in the classic teachings, like the human realm is pretty far up there. The animal realm is below. There's this hierarchy of beings. And what we're learning in what the ecological way of looking is teaching us and teaching the Dharma, which needs to be updated in this respect, is there is that we are in a company of wisdom and of genius in this ecological field. We are learning about the wisdom of trees. We are only beginning to appreciate the genius of octopi, the deep heart of elephants. Only beginning, because what? Because of course we would think that way, because we didn't have the capacity, the means to recognize it and appreciate it in my culture, and didn't. Indigenous cultures, absolutely, a very, very different relationship to that field of being. But the Dharma, while you have spoken so beautifully to our tradition's connection to trees in particular, in part of that secularization and part of that coming into form amidst a scientific materialist worldview, that has been left behind, that appreciation for the full dignity, the unfathomability. And I would say not better than, worse than, not same as applies to the ecological other. And that is what ecological ways of looking can bring to us in when we hold our seat from the Dharma way of looking. And so those are ways that the Dharma needs the ecological. The ecological, I would say, needs the Dharma, because ecological ways of looking are vulnerable to, actually, as opposed to elevating the human above nature. Ecological ways of looking, that is to say, environmental movements, conservation movements, can sometimes do the opposite. So they put the human below the earth. That is, maybe it takes the form of humans are the problem. The earth is better off without us. We are a cancer upon the earth. Ouch. Ouch. She'll just shake us off like a bad cold. The earth will be fine. She doesn't need the human. Nature will thrive without the human. First of all, scientifically incorrect. humans have had this mutual exchange with nature in many, many cultures that is quite beneficial to the rest of nature, the full ecological system. So scientifically, not so. But we can recognize in that a kind of self-aversion, and that's the ouch. Like, wow, we're just like evil. We're just the problem. We're just like nothing but bad. And that colludes with sometimes the individual self-hating that can happen. Maybe we just don't know how to be in relationship with how much harm we can cause and have caused various us versions of us. And that's what we need to come in contact and come to terms with and take responsibility for, but not to hate ourselves and to want self-eradication. But it also colludes with a very flat view of what the human is. That is to say, from a science, which is really in strong relationship with that ecological view. Scientifically, we're just a bunch of atoms. We're star stuff. It's kind of beautiful in a way. Again, all of these ideas really having their beautiful dimensions. We're star stuff. We like this whole system has got like not just human cells, but a bunch of non-human cells in it. And we're just like this coagulation of all these natural systems, and it's all sort of just playing out, and we can just decompose and decompose and decompose until we get atoms and molecules, and that's what's going on here. And yet it doesn't really have that much meaning unto itself. There's not meaningfulness here. And I don't mean just like a purpose and a destiny, but like something really beautiful and powerful and mysterious and unknowable that's happening here. And then we take science further, and actually we start to get there with at the quantum level of like a quantum uncertainty, and even beyond Heisenberg uncertainty, if you're familiar with that, like to really like right now what's happening in quantum science is like the role of perception. Gee, like what a huge role that has in how even we are perceiving in what it is we're even measuring that we think is objective. It's all kind of getting more and more up for grabs, and more soft and elastic and open. And there's so much more space and uncertainty here in all of that. So science is grabbing hold of that. But it's still, in a way, has this tendency to remove meaningfulness. To say, at the end of the day, especially in secular communities, and purely that we can love science, but science doesn't love us back. We can love the cosmos, but the cosmos doesn't love us back.
In the scientific view.
In the scientific view, exactly. And that can produce a kind of sense of meaninglessness, of actual alienation. What am I doing here? What is life? It's just a bunch of atoms banging around. So, and again, just like that's a kind of Newtonian era, this is not updated with, it is not so much in relationship. It's kind of caught in the past scientific view, but it's still very flat. And I have heard like scientists who are very much at leading edge saying, if you think the universe cares about you, you are a child. Oh, another ouch. Ouch. Like you are immature. You haven't come to terms with how things really are. Sound familiar? From a scientific perspective, the priests, we should say, of the high science are the ones who, according to themselves, get it. They're the ones who really understand what is happening not only in this world, but in this universe. And they have, I would argue they should stay in their lane. Stay in your lane. It's beautiful. I love science. I mean, I really dig science. I really am so nourished by scientific wonder. And stay in your lane. That is, don't get into the realm of meaningfulness. That is a spiritual question. That is a philosophical question. It is not something that is in the domain of science, but there's still that self-ennobling quality. We're the ones who get it. So that is part of the bypassing that the scientific, the ecological can do, that is helped by the Dharma, that is helped by the social justice, to say there is meaningfulness, to say we are responsible for what is happening here collectively. We can be part of something quite beautiful and mysterious unfolding, but from a place of humility and wonder and deep investigation into causes and condition.
What is the light that's cast by social justice work that illuminates things in the shadow of spiritual practice? And what are the things in the shadow of social justice work that spirituality can help illuminate?
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so on the blessing side, there's this call for collective ethics, equity, just plain old fairness, just a recognition of just how unjust we can be with each other, and recognizing, understanding the particular devices that we employ, how it is we practice, if you will, in a unskillful way, collective injustice. So calling for the full recognition and dignity, the worth of every human, not just those with the favored physical attributes, with the pre-existing wealth and power, the culturally valued talents, all of us, each of us. The impossibility of that project and the necessity of that project. How that collective project is one that actually nourishes all of us when we really look closely, is mutually nourishing. It isn't a zero-sum game. So justice valuing perceptions of truth, ways of learning, knowing, being that are diverse, recognizing the wealth of the human family and the ways that we can learn and appreciate so much from each other. And how necessary that work is. Justice calls us, I love this about justice because it calls me, I think it calls us to recognize not just instances of injustice, not just individual stories, but patterns. It recognizes the tendencies, the impacts of ways of looking that tend to devalue some people and overvalue other people. That this is how we do it. That justice calls us to see, I think, the ways in which we make ourselves an exception. Oh, I don't have colorized ways of looking. I'm not that problem. I'm not guilty of racism. I'm not guilty of colorism. That's over there. And it calls us to recognize, like, this is happening. And we are trained to see that if I have taken on these problematic ways of looking, then I'm part of the problem. I'm a horrible person. Justice invites us, really presses us to say, look hard at yourself. And it can be very challenging to do that. But justice asks us to go there. justice is also saying, like, carrying that even further, like what you think of as your earned, the meritocracy, the idea of a meritocracy, that is that everything that has come to you is because of your hard work and you're sort of playing by the rules. Justice asks us to say, really? Are you sure? If you look carefully, in my case, did I earn all of the benefits that I have in my life? Or were some of them just granted? Was I, in a counter way, were there barriers that I never faced that others face every single minute of every day? And so it was just a lot easier for me. So justice invites us to these really challenging questions. And all of us, I think those of us who have these kind of unearned benefits and those who don't, justice is really, if it's really taken wholly, can really help us question all that we might presume is just fine, not a problem. And there are bypasses here as well. There are vulnerabilities and risks that the ecological way of looking and the Dharma way of looking, the spiritual way of looking, can really help us with. So what I have seen, and I really want to own that, I'm very much a learner in this space, is that emphasis on looking hard at yourself, and the emphasis on there's a kind of confrontational piece of it that I really, really appreciate, and taken too far, it can negate our spiritual goodness. It can, so for instance, whereas justice asks us to look not so much at intention, but at impacts. I think that's really, really good. And yet it can just say intentions totally don't matter. And I think a more nuanced view is that, yes, impacts matter first, but we can, once we've really acknowledged impacts, we can bring in intention. Intention matters at some point, but hardcore justice ways of looking negate intention, negate spiritual goodness. So complexity, nuance, the importance of kindness, the kind of it is justice. When we really practice in justice ways of looking, we can sort of cultivate a certain aversion in a certain way. Like I don't think it's always like this, but in its most hardcore way of looking, that it's highly aversive, and it also needs the external collective to be different, and then I'm okay. That is, I'm not okay until all of this changes. Ooh, uh-oh. And that's where the Dharma can be really helpful, because the Dharma can say, actually, I can cultivate a lot of okayness here, and I can really take responsibility for my own reactivity and really accept, oh, this is how it is, and this is because of patterns and causes and conditions. And then I can work for change. And no, ultimately, I'm not going to be completely okay, but I can be relatively steady and strong while this is so problematic. So those are ways that the two can really help each other a lot. So that sword of wisdom can sometimes become an axe to grind, where it's like we're always pointing out what's wrong. And that can really, really erode what can be actually our friends, our collaborators, we need each other in these projects of social change. So that strong emphasis on critique colludes with, in a Buddhist sense, the judging mind, the aversion that makes a separate contracted self, seated in a judging space. It can ignore and downplay and actually miss its own shortcomings, its own limited ways of looking and being. So attached to outcomes, so attached to things needing to be different. And I would say that same pattern with the other lights, the self-ennobling quality is here too. We're the ones who get it. We're the ones who are right. The others are wrong. And that same kind of righteousness that can be present in the ecological ways of looking, the scientific, like we're the ones who really understand the cosmos, the universe, there's no meaning here, that sort of elevated, we're the ones who get it, or in the Dharma sense, like we're the ones who are kind of able to face suffering and be with things as they are, or in this justice way of looking, we're the ones who really get it, who really understand how colorism works, how racism works, how classism works. Like we're the ones who know and others don't know. And there can be so much pain that is caused in that critique-oriented, and there's a self that's contracted and it's blaming others and shaming others, or maybe blaming this one here and shaming this one here. And what the Dharma brings to that is so beautiful and so essential, which is this recognition that real change, fundamental, lasting change happens. It utterly depends on kindness, on a kind of softening. Kindness isn't the whole thing, but kindness must be there to support the softening that can recognize, like, oh, I do have colorist or classist ways of looking. I do have that. Like, of course I would. And let me take responsibility for that. Being super rigid can actually work against the realization, the manifestation of justice, and an ironic kind of softening that still holds account, but is compassionate, is understanding. We can really meet each other. So those are some of the ways that I would say the Dharma can really help justice. And then finally, just on the ecological front, maybe I'll just mention one piece of it, which is that the ecological encountering the justice shadow says, absolutely humans matter and all humans matter, but the ecological matters. That a hardcore justice, I guess to put it, kind of maybe press it too far, it's almost as if the project of justice is so that we can all exploit the earth equally. And that can't be where we want to go. So what the ecological challenges and the light that it casts on the shadow of justice is to say, we need to look, yes, at the human, but beyond the human. Justice includes the more than human, includes the ecological. And we are utterly interdependent on a flourishing ecology, all of us. And there's so much beauty and blessing to come when we elevate the ecological relatives as well as our human relatives. So, does that seem to cover a lot of territory? I feel like
you have just invited us into and walked us through this incredibly rich and useful presentation. And I'm full of lots of intriguing ideas some of which I've heard you say before, and others you've suddenly opened a window into a different direction. And I think that you're leaving a lot of us with a lot of reflection to do. My friend, thank you for opening your big heart and sharing some of its beauty with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure to get to know you and your community. And I really hope that this serves in some small way. Because we need each other. We need each other's lights, and we can help each other with each other's shadows. So I love to explore this territory.
Me too. And I'm sure it will help, but not in a small way. Thanks, Kristin.